Alright guys, this is our video for APUSH, first video for Wednesday, April 29th. We're in the middle of the 1920s. We cover the presidential people, the 20s yesterday, Harding and Coolidge. Now we're looking at the culture of the 1920s. Modern culture. No consumer product better typified the new spirit of the nation than the automobile. At first, automobiles were expensive conveniences, affordable only to the extremely wealthy. Then Henry Ford perfected the assembly line in mass production, which lowered the cost of automobiles. By the end of the decade, most middle-class families could afford a car. The automobile allowed those who worked in the cities to move farther away from city centers, thus giving birth to suburbs, which in turn transformed the automobile from a convenience to necessity. The impact of the automobile in the 1920s was tremendous, forcing areas to quickly develop roadways and means of policing traffic. In 1929, with the population topping 100 million in the most recent census, more than 23 million automobiles were registered in the United States. The radio followed automobiles in changing the nation's culture. 10 million families owned radios. In the cities, it was not unusual for several families to gather at the home of a radio owner and settle in for the evening. As more houses gained access to electric power, household appliance sales boomed as well. The advertising industry grew up during this decade to hype up all these new products. Although advertisements from the era look pretty goofy to us now, they were quite effective at convincing people to buy stuff they did not really need, not too different from today. All this consumerism required money, and single-earner households often couldn't afford to keep up with Joneses. More women entered the working world as a result. While the vast majority of married women continued to stay at home, more than ever, about 15% entered the workforce. Women continued, as they had in the past, to work in predominantly female-dominated professions, often called pink-collar jobs, such as school teaching or office assistant work, and to earn much less than men. Despite the persistence of traditional roles for women, a new image of American women emerged and became a symbol of the Roaring Twenties, the flapper. World War I, the allure of the big city, the right to vote, and new attitudes brought about by the ideas of Sigmund Freud, whose ideas were just beginning to circulate in the United States during the 1920s, opened up a whole new world for this new generation of emancipated women. They discarded the corset, layers of petticoats, and long, dark dresses worn by their Victorian grandmothers in favor of waistless dresses worn above the knee, flesh-colored silk stockings, cute little hats, strings of long beads, and a wrist full of bracelets and a ruby red lips. Many flappers risked ruining their reputation by smoking cigarettes, drinking in public, and dancing the tango, the lindy, and the shimmy. Also, all this happening during Prohibition. The rapid modernization of American society was reflected in the way it entertained itself. Movies grew tremendously popular during the decade, reflecting back at the nation its idealized self-image. On movie screens, young, independent-minded, gorgeous heroes and heroines defied all odds to succeed in romance, and at the same time, strike it rich. Sports grew more popular as well, especially baseball, whose greatest player of the era, Babe Ruth, was idolized by millions. In literature, America gained international prominence through such world-class authors as F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and playwright Eugene O'Neill. Ironically, many of these writers moved to Europe, where they chronicled their alienation from the modern era, which explains why they became known as the Lost Generation. In the largest black neighborhood in New York City, theaters, culture clubs, and newspapers sprang up, a development called the Harlem Renaissance. W.B. Du Bois opened writers' centers, and his prominence helped draw the attention to Harlem's cultural movement. Among the great figures of the Harlem Renaissance were poets Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and Zora Neale Hurston. Another major black cultural development was the popularization of jazz, because jazz featured improvisation and free-spiritedness. It became to be seen as emblematic of the era, also called the Jazz Age. Probably the most well-known musician was Louis Armstrong from New Orleans. This is also the time of Marcus Garvey trying to push the Back to Africa movement and try to push black pride and culture in America. Backlash against modern culture. Not all Americans were excited about the rapid transition into the modern age, and the 1920s were also a time of considerable reactionary backlash and renewed nativism. Most prominently, the Ku Klux Klan grew to more than 5 million members and widened its targets, attacking blacks, Jews, urbanites, and anyone whose behavior deviated from the Klan's narrowly defeated code of acceptable Christian behavior. Anti-immigration groups grew in strength as well, targeting the growing number of Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Accusations that America's newcomers were dangerous subversives intensified when 2 Italian immigrant anarchists, Secco and Vanzetti, were arrested on charges of murder. Their trial immediately became a cause to celebrate for the political left, as the evidence against them was inconclusive. Nonetheless, they were convicted and executed. At the start of the decade, the United States started setting limits and quotas to restrict immigration. The Emergency Quota Act of 1924 set immigration quotas based on national origins and discriminated against the new immigrants who came from South and Eastern Europe. These limits were set to reduce foreign influence on the country. Another famous trial also illustrated the social tensions of the decade. In 1925, Tennessee passed a law forbidding teachers to teach the theory of evolution. John Thomas Scopes broke the law, and his trial, dubbed the Scopes Monkey Trial, drew national attention, due in part to the prominent attorneys arguing the case, Clarence Darrow and William James Bryan, who you may recall ran for president in 1896, 1900, 1908. The case also captivated the nation because, for many, it encapsulated the debate over whether to stick with tradition or abandon it for progress' sake. 19th century morals played a part in the institution of prohibition, which banned the manufacture, sale, transport of alcoholic beverages. The prohibition movement had its roots in the reform campaigns of the 1830s and remained a mainstay of women's political agendas until, on the eve of women's enfranchisement, the 18th Amendment outlawed the American liquor industry. Many people soon came to resent the government's intrusion into what they considered a private matter. Prohibition was further weakened by the effectiveness of organized crime in producing and selling liquor, especially in the cities. Open warfare between competing gangs and between criminals and law enforcement earned this period the title of the gangster era, which inspired many movies and a television series. Prohibition was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. Hoover in the beginning of the Great Depression. In 1928, the Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover. A little like Coolidge, Hoover was able to parlay a strong economy into an easy victory. During his campaign, Hoover predicted the day would soon come when no American would live in poverty. He turned out to be very wrong. In October of 1929, the bottom fell out of the stock market, and this was one of the reasons for the Great Depression, but not the main reason. Prices dropped, and no matter how far they dropped, nobody wanted to buy. Hoover and his advisors underestimated the damage that the stock market crash would eventually cause. Convinced that the economy was sound, Hoover reassured the public that only stock traders would be hurt because of irresponsible speculation. Traders had only been allowed to buy on the margin, which meant that they might have to put up only 10 or 20% of the cost of each stock, allowing them to borrow against future profits that might or may not materialize. Margin buying is a destabilizing practice that was illegal soon after the crash. Unfortunately, among those speculators were huge banks and corporations which suddenly found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy, unable to pay employees or guarantee bank deposits. Other factors contributed to the plunging nation into a national depression. Immediately following World War I, the carnage of the conflict, along with Germany's disastrous attempts to satisfy its reparations obligations under the Treaty of Versailles, had put Europe's economy and much of the rest of the world into a depression. Domestically, though manufacturers and farmers had been overproducing for years, creating large inventories, this led factories to lay off workers and made the farmers' crops worth much less on the market. Furthermore, production of new consumer goods was outstripping the public's ability to buy them. Supply so exceeded demand for so many goods that this might be the main underlying cause of the Great Depression, ultimately leading to the deflation of unemployment and business failures. Finally, government laxity in regulating large businesses had led to the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of very few businessmen. When their businesses failed, many people were thrown out of work. The Depression had a calamitous effect on tens of millions of Americans. People lost their jobs as their employers went bankrupt, or to avoid bankruptcy, laid off the majority of workers. People lost their life savings as thousands of banks failed, and many lost their homes when they could not keep up with the mortgage payments. The homeless built shanty towns, sarcastically called Hoovervilles. In rural areas, farmers struggled to survive as to produce prices dropped more than 50%. Furthermore, a prolonged drought affected the Great Plains area in the Midwest, turned the region into the giant Dust Bowl. The situation encouraged agrarian unrest. Farmers fought evictions and foreclosures by attacking those who tried to enforce them. Farmers also conspired to keep prices at farm auctions low and then return the auction property to its original owner. In addition, they formed the Farm Holiday Association, which organized demonstrations and threatened a nationwide walkout by farmers in order to raise prices. At first, Hoover opposed any federal relief efforts because he believed they violated Americans' ideal of rugged individualism. As the Depression worsened, he initiated a few farm assistance programs and came for federal farm works projects such as the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam that would create jobs. He hoped that raising tariffs would help American business, but the Hawley-Smoot tariff actually worsened the economy. The Hawley-Smoot tariff was the highest protective tariff in U.S. history. It was enacted during one of the worst economic depressions ever. Hoover's most embarrassing moment came in 1932 when Congress considered early payment benefits to World War I veterans. Tens of thousands of impoverished veterans and their families, called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus Army, came to Washington to lobby for the bill. When the bill was nearly defeated, many refused to leave. They squatted in empty government offices or built shanties and stayed through the summer. In July, Hoover ordered the Army to expel them, when Douglas MacArthur chose to do it with excessive force. Employing the cavalry and attacking with tear gas, Army forces drove the veterans from D.C. and then burned the makeshift homes. 100 people died during the attack, including 2 babies who suffocated from exposure to tear gas. Stop video 1 there.